For centuries, Judas Iscariot has been synonymous with betrayal, the man who sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, sealing his fate with a kiss on the cheek of Jesus. His name is spoken with disdain, a warning of treachery and greed. But what if we've misunderstood his role? What if Judas was not a traitor, but a willing participant in a divine plan? In 2006, the world was shaken by the discovery of an ancient manuscript, the Gospel of Judas. Hidden for nearly 1,700 years, this text tells a radically different story. Judas wasn't a villain. He was Jesus' most trusted disciple, handpicked to fulfill a sacred mission. Was Judas truly a betrayer, or was he chosen to play the most difficult role in history? Did he betray Jesus out of greed, or was he following Jesus' own instructions? The answers could change everything we thought we knew about Christianity. The Gospel that vanished. The Gospel of Judas is part of a collection of texts known as the Gnostic Gospels. Unlike the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these writings offer alternative views of Jesus' teachings. Early church leaders deemed them heretical, seeking to erase them from history. The Gospel of Judas was condemned in the writings of the church father Irenaeus in 180 AD. He called it a blasphemous text that twisted the true faith. But instead of being destroyed, it was hidden away, buried in the sands of Egypt, until its rediscovery in the 20th century. What the Gospel of Judas reveals. The manuscript, written in Coptic, presents a shocking revelation. Jesus speaks to Judas privately, revealing secrets unknown to the other disciples. He tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." In this gospel, Jesus does not view Judas as a traitor, but as his closest confidant. He entrusts Judas with a mission, one that only he can fulfill. Jesus explains that the material world is corrupt, and that true salvation comes from the Spirit. By turning Jesus over to the authorities, Judas is not betraying him, but helping him complete his divine purpose, to shed his earthly body and return to the spiritual realm. Judas, the ultimate sacrifice. The Gospel of Judas paints a picture of a disciple burdened with an impossible task. Unlike the other apostles who misunderstand Jesus' mission, Judas alone comprehends the truth. He must be the instrument of Jesus' transition from flesh to divinity. But if this is true, then Judas was not acting out of greed or evil. He was making the greatest sacrifice of all, accepting eternal condemnation in the eyes of the world so that Jesus could fulfill his purpose. Imagine the agony he must have felt, to be remembered not as the most faithful, but as the most reviled. What about the canonical Gospels? The Gospel of Judas contradicts the New Testament. The four canonical Gospels describe Judas as a thief, a man driven by Satan himself. Matthew says that Judas regretted his actions, threw the silver into the temple, and hanged himself in despair. Mark and Luke depict him as an agent of evil, possessed by Satan. John portrays him as greedy, stealing from the disciples' funds. But what if these accounts were written to fit a certain narrative? The early Christian movement faced persecution and needed unity. By portraying Judas as a villain, they solidified the image of Jesus' suffering and betrayal. Yet even in the canonical Gospels, there are hints of something deeper. At the Last Supper, Jesus tells Judas, "What you are about to do quickly." Why would Jesus instruct Judas if he was truly a traitor? Could it be that he knew this was the only way to fulfill prophecy? Who wanted Jesus dead? To understand Judas's role, we must ask, who wanted Jesus dead? The religious authorities feared Jesus' growing influence. His teachings challenged their power. The Romans saw him as a potential political threat. Yet, according to prophecy, the Messiah had to be delivered up to die for the sins of the world. Someone had to play that role. Could Judas have been chosen by Jesus himself for this painful task? The Gospel of Judas and Gnostic teachings. The Gospel of Judas aligns with Gnostic beliefs. Gnosticism taught that the material world was a prison and that salvation came through secret knowledge, gnosis. In this view, Jesus' death was not a tragedy, but a liberation. The body was a temporary shell, and Judas helped Jesus shed it. This perspective threatened early Christian leaders. The idea that Judas was part of the divine plan contradicted the message they wanted to spread. So, they erased it from history. The ultimate question, was Judas a villain or a hero? If the Gospel of Judas is true, it challenges everything we thought we knew. Was Judas a traitor, or was he the most faithful disciple? Did he act out of greed, or was he following Jesus' orders? Was he condemned, or was he chosen? This gospel forces us to reconsider the nature of sacrifice, destiny, and divine will. It invites us to see Judas not as a betrayer, but as the disciple who carried out the hardest mission of all. Perhaps the true betrayal was not by Judas, but by history itself. What do you believe? The story of Judas is one of the most debated in history. If the Gospel of Judas is true, then one of Christianity's greatest villains might actually be its greatest servant. So, what do you believe? Did Judas betray Jesus or fulfill his destiny? Judas and the prophetic puzzle. If we look deeper into biblical prophecy, we see something astonishing. The betrayal of Jesus was not an accident. It was foretold. Psalm 41:9 states, "Even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me." Was this a direct reference to Judas, or was it a prophecy that had to be fulfilled no matter what? Jesus himself spoke of betrayal in John 13:18, acknowledging that Scripture had to be fulfilled. But this raises a profound question. Was Judas condemned for playing a role that was divinely mandated? If prophecy declared that Jesus must be betrayed, then did Judas even have a choice? Or was he merely fulfilling what had already been written? If Judas had refused, would someone else have stepped into his place? The deeper we dig, the more it seems that Judas may have been following a script written long before he was even born. Why would Jesus choose Judas? Jesus was not naive. He handpicked his 12 disciples, knowing each of their strengths and weaknesses. If Judas was destined to betray him, why would Jesus include him in his inner circle? The Gospel of Judas suggests that Jesus deliberately chose him because he was the only disciple who truly understood his mission. The other apostles, according to the text, were obsessed with earthly power and misunderstood the spiritual kingdom Jesus was speaking about. But Judas, the Gospel claims, saw beyond the material world. If this was true, it would mean Jesus knew he needed someone who could carry out the painful act that would ultimately lead to salvation. This was not just an act of betrayal, it was a sacrifice. Judas had to bear the burden of history's hatred so that Jesus could complete his divine purpose. But if Jesus did choose Judas for this role, does that mean Judas was ever truly guilty? The Gnostic idea of the good betrayal. In mainstream Christianity, betrayal is seen as an ultimate sin. But in Gnostic teachings, things were not so black and white. The material world was seen as corrupt, and anything that helped liberate the spirit was considered a necessary step toward salvation. Judas, in this view, was not an enemy of Christ, but his greatest helper. He did what no one else could do. He set the final act in motion. The Gospel of Judas suggests that Jesus needed Judas to break the chains of his human form. While this view is shocking to traditional Christians, it forces us to rethink the meaning of sacrifice. Could it be that Judas's role was not one of betrayal, but of obedience? Did Judas truly hang himself, or was this a later invention? One of the most haunting images of Judas's story is his death. Matthew 27:5 tells us that Judas, overcome with guilt, threw the silver into the temple and hanged himself. Yet in Acts 1:18 we get a different version of events. Judas is said to have fallen headfirst, his body bursting open. Two conflicting accounts, two different deaths. Why? Some scholars argue that these details were added later to solidify Judas's image as a cursed man. The harsher his fate, the easier it was to cement him as the ultimate traitor. But if Judas was following Jesus' instructions, would he have been overcome with guilt at all? Or could it be that his death was the result of others seeking to silence him? Perhaps those who feared that he held a dangerous truth? Was Judas a scapegoat? It is worth considering the political reality of the time. The Roman authorities needed a justification for executing Jesus. The religious elite needed a way to remove a man who threatened their control. By pinning the blame on Judas, they created a perfect scapegoat. They didn't have to take responsibility for Jesus' death. Judas did that for them. And once Judas was gone, there was no one left to tell his side of the story. The Gospel of Judas gives us that missing perspective. It suggests that the truth about Judas was deliberately erased because it did not fit the story the early church wanted to tell. The final question: was Judas forgiven? If Judas truly carried out Jesus' wishes, then would God have condemned him? Or would he have been rewarded for his painful but necessary role? Mainstream Christianity has long assumed that Judas was damned, but nowhere in the Bible does Jesus directly say that Judas would suffer eternal punishment. Instead, we have hints of something else. In Luke 23:34, as Jesus is dying on the cross, he prays, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Did this forgiveness extend to Judas? In Matthew 26:24, Jesus says, "It would be better for him if he had not been born." But does this mean Judas was doomed, or that the suffering he would endure, being remembered as a traitor for all of history, was too great for anyone to bear? The answer remains elusive. Judas, the man who changed history. Whether you see Judas as a villain or a misunderstood disciple, one thing is undeniable: his actions shaped history. Without him, there would have been no crucifixion, no resurrection, no Christianity as we know it. If Judas was truly following Jesus' will, then he made the ultimate sacrifice. Not just his life, but his reputation, his legacy, and his place in history. So, was Judas Iscariot a cursed betrayer, or was he the most loyal disciple of all? The answer may be more complicated than we ever imagined.